She can do whatever she wants. No, she's acting like she's the queen and we're the sorry people.
Reality TV in the 2000s. What a time to be alive. Especially when that reality TV involves children. In this video I'm going to be talking about Supernanny and Wife Swap and shows of that nature. Even if you haven't seen one of those shows before, you've probably heard of one of them and the interesting stories that come out of the shows. Before we go any further in this video, I have an announcement. This video is sponsored. This video is sponsored by me. I have now activated YouTube channel memberships, meaning you can get early access to all of my future videos and have priority on what topics I cover, plus little extra bits like Q&As and bonus content and things like that. All channel memberships will help fund me making video essays about unhinged topics like wife swap and Supernanny. And you will have my eternal gratitude. So there's that. And let's get on with the video.
My family was a wife swap and it was the worst mistake of our lives.
They are definitely from another origin. Coconut cream, that's curry.
He had punched his daughter in the nose and broke her nose. Yeah, our episode was never aired.
Let's start with explaining what exactly these shows are. Wife Swap is a reality TV show that ran from 2003 to 2017 in the UK, and it revolves around two very different families, and the wife and mother of each household swap lives to try and see how the other family lives. And the general idea is that each woman will come away from the experience learning something new that they can implement in their own families and households, and possibly change for the better. Isn't your heart just warm? For this to work, the family's differences have to be highlighted. A big family versus a small family, clean versus tidy, strict versus relaxed, wealthy versus poor, gender roles versus more fluid roles, and bigoted versus non-bigoted. Yes, that's right.
I was expecting to walk in there and it smelled like Muslims, but it didn't.
The families are set up in a way that is going to influence the audience's ideas about them. Usually this is making one of the families the butt of the joke, though there are times that the families are both so extreme they're kind of both the joke. Wife Swap very much centres women in the domestic sphere. Can you imagine a show from the 2000s being called Husband Swap? Yeah, me neither. It centres women as the primary caregivers and the household managers. Mothering is a very critical part of the show. It sort of implies that to be a wife is to also be a mother, is to also be a woman. The show kind of treats all of these things as the same thing. So parenting, mothering in particular, is a significant element of Wife Swap. Later on, I'm going to be quite critical of the parenting within Wife Swap, but in a very different way. I'm not interested in being hypercritical of a mother feeding her child a ready meal, for example. I'm more interested in both parents' need for dominance and control over their children and unacknowledged mental health issues that might make them neglectful parents. In the show Supernanny, which ran from 2004 to 2008 in the UK, child expert Jo Frost visits families who are struggling with their children's behaviour. She observes the family for a little while, then she sits the parents down to tell them what needs improving, then starts implementing her strategies for the family. The show puts the responsibility of the children's behaviour on the parents, which I believe is a good thing, but the show only really works if the viewers see how naughty and badly behaved the children are. Some typical bad behaviour we see from the kids on Supernanny are things like not following instructions, getting out of bed at night, swearing, hitting siblings or their parents, or refusing to stay on the naughty step. You might ask, who is child expert Jo Frost? Well, Jo does have extensive experience in childcare. She was a professional nanny for many years. She doesn't have a formal qualification, which makes some people question the validity of her advice. And I think some of this questioning is fair. After all, she is going into families' homes and teaching them how to discipline their children without holding any qualifications in child development or psychology. I can understand wanting to hold people who work with children to a particular standard, but with that being said, there is obviously a lot of value in having hands-on practical experience. The criticism that I think is less valid is when people criticise Jo Frost for doing this job but not having any children of her own. Do we also criticise criticise teachers, child psychologists and paediatricians for working with children but not having any children of their own. There have been other shows similar to Wife Swap, like Trading Spouses or The Swap, and shows similar to Supernanny like Nanny 911, House of Tiny Terrorways, Joe Frost Extreme Parental Guidance, and Family SOS with Joe Frost. Okay, Joe Frost, building an empire, I see. And these shows are very much the same idea in the same format, so although I'll be mentioning Wife Swap and Supernanny the most throughout this video, my thoughts are kind of the same on all of these shows. And do not even get me started on the kids version of Super Size versus Super Skinny. I may have to start committing crimes. Super Size versus Super Skinny, my gateway into a life of crime.
When you pinch me,
Not
I don't like it.
unacceptable.
We have entered an era of finally starting to acknowledge that being in the spotlight can really negatively impact children, with many 2000s child stars starting to be honest about how much it's really affected them.
To this day, I have fragments of my self-concept that originated from character breakdowns.
My mom encouraged and conditioned my anorexia.
And I lived with Sean Puffy Combs for a year. I don't know if I could indulge and understand what I was even looking at.
Anything from an undeveloped sense of self to body image issues to addiction to vulnerability to abuse. It seems like we're just starting to scratch the surface with this sort of stuff, and there needs to be a lot more changes and additions to laws and regulations to obviously better protect child performers. But we're only really seeing the impact of being in the spotlight within children in traditional media. If we look at social media, whole different ball game. The creator economy is so new, we haven't really had chance to see the full extent of the impact it's had on children with a platform into their adulthoods, because a lot of them just haven't got there yet. The lines around what is considered work for a child on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok is still really blurry. If we use family vlogging, for example, when is it considered work? Is it only considered work when the family reaches a certain follower count? Which parts of the child appearing in a video is them working? Like, is the child working when they're caught in the background of the video? Is the child working when the parents film them shaving their legs? Yeah, that happened and I can't go into it. I've got neither the time nor the will. Family vlogging has been hugely criticised in online spaces for the past few years now, only now and again catching mainstream attention with cases like Daddio5, a family channel owned by parents Mike and Heather Martin, who were sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation over 2 counts of child neglect. The case of Fantastic Adventures, a fully scripted skit-based YouTube channel that the kids would act in, run by Michelle Hobson, who was charged with 30 counts of felony abuse to these children. And the more recent case of Ruby Frank, owner of the channel 8 Passengers, and her business partner Jodie Hildebrandt, who were both sent to prison for up to 30 years for child abuse. Aside from these really big cases of child abuse, a lot of people haven't yet seemed to clock onto all of the other more subtle issues with sharing your children on social media. There is actually a term coined now for oversharing your child on social media, and that is sharenting. It's a difficult one to regulate because a lot of countries' laws around child privacy end up defaulting to the parent or guardian to give consent for the child. But the research that has been done so far on sharenting does show that children and teenagers are often embarrassed and frustrated about the content their parents choose to share of them. Over 71% of the 12 to 16-year-olds in this one particular study said they felt their parents failed to give enough respect towards their digital identity. I think that the experience kids had on shows like Supernanny and Wife Swap is comparable to the experience kids have on family vlogging channels. How did these kids feel about being on these shows, especially when they're shown to be misbehaving? Did they understand the impact of having their bad behaviour on TV? Probably not. They were probably outside, like eating dirt or doing whatever kids do. With reality TV, adults consent to being part of it, and that's often used to refute any bad experiences. In my previous videos on the classic British staples, Love Island and The Jeremy Kyle Show, I talk about informed consent and about how it's slightly different to just simply consent. How TV shows have a responsibility to explain explain something to the participant, not just assume they understand something. I also talked about the ethics of having vulnerable people on reality TV, and that was all just for adults. With shows like Wife Swap and Supernanny, we're now also talking about children. Parents are responsible for their children, so will need to give consent for them to do anything from going on a school trip, to having vaccinations, to them getting a piercing, to them going on TV. And it's assumed that a parent will use reasonable judgment to consent for their child to do something. For the most part, this is, of course, a system that makes sense. However, there are times where the ethics of parental consent might be called into question. Up until 2022 in England and Wales, 16 and 17-year-olds could get married with parental consent, meaning a 16-year-old who's doing their GCSEs could marry a 60-year-old as long as their parents were consenting. And as you might imagine, this is something that disproportionately affected teenage girls, with children's charity Bernardo's saying that it contributed to sexual violence and abuse. The law has changed now, so you can only get married at 18 years old, but clearly this is an example of how parents consenting to something might still be harming the child. So bear that in mind. Let's look at another example of how parental consent can backfire. The Nirvana Baby lawsuit. Nirvana released their album Nevermind in 1991 with a naked baby on the front cover. His parents obviously consented to the photo shoot, but when Spencer grew up into an adult, he believed it was inappropriate. I think his parents were paid a set fee, but with how successful the album and the band was, I don't think he saw really any profits. Correct me if I'm wrong though. Spencer said, "It's kind of creepy that so many people have seen me naked," and he sued Nirvana over child sexual exploitation, but he lost the lawsuit. There are conversations being had at the moment around family vloggers and how children get paid, and if they get paid at all. And with child-focused reality TV shows like Supernanny, House of Tiny Terrors and Little Angels, I wonder the same thing. I'm assuming the parents who took the child on the show are the ones who got paid a small set fee, but that seems so unfair when the child is the one providing the product. The child misbehaving is the product that you're selling. I also noticed a trend in both adults and children participating in these sort of shows and then listing them as a TV credit in their performing portfolio. For example, Janine James, who appeared as a parent on the show Little Angels, currently has only 3 credits on her IMDb. To add some context if you didn't know, to register as a performer on a lot of these industry platforms like Spotlight and things like that, you usually already need some credits to show that you have worked in entertainment before. So when I see numerous parents putting their naughty child on television and then putting that as a credit in their portfolio, it feels, I want to say, exploitative. There's also just the general safety aspect of putting your kid on a show like Wife Swap or Supernanny. There was one episode of Wife Swap where the dad left his 1-year-old with the new Wife Swap wife and the film crew, so, you know, strangers, while he went to work. And a child on Supernanny later came out as an adult describing how the film crew were in the children's bedrooms and bathrooms and filming them in these private spaces. Were all the members of the film crew required to have what is known in the UK as a DBS check? This is a criminal record check that you have to work with vulnerable groups like children. Were the other families DBS checked? There's also a concern that's relatively new, that's only really been talked about in recent years, and that is your child's digital footprint. Maybe this is something that was less discussed when shows like Wife Swap and Supernanny were filming, but when you put your child's identity out there, and these children had their faces, their full names, the towns they were living in exposed on TV, there's a lot of issues with people stealing children's identities and committing fraud. Children's digital footprint also refers to any bits of information or photos or videos of them that may cause a chain-like reaction for them as they grow up and get older, affecting things like their self-esteem and their self-concept, their self-image. We're going to talk more about those in the next section though. A lot of the specific problems with children in the media and on TV are not the typical day-to-day problems that most children face. We're going to get into those issues more in a little bit, but first let's look more closely at Wife Swap and Supernanny and the impact of spotlighting naughty children on TV.
Big girl, isn't it?
I am a big girl, yes, definitely.
You're gonna have to have a makeover, mine. I don't want to be a bit cheeky, like, but you're gonna have to have a makeover, like.
When you were a kid, did your parent ever tell the rest of your family or maybe one of their friends a story about you misbehaving or doing something wrong, it probably really embarrassed you, didn't it? And imagine if they filmed that moment of you misbehaving and broadcast it on TV. A family's story being restricted to one episode is immortalizing a child's challenging behavior. There's no chance of redemption or change outside of that 45-minute window. Even if the children on these shows grew up into adults who can rationalize the experience and understand that all children misbehave sometimes, it probably didn't feel nice for them as children to realize that video footage of them screaming, crying, being in genuine distress, and then sometimes being violent with their family is on TV for anyone to see. Let's look at the Cook family on Supernanny UK. The girls often physically fight with each other and end up in screaming matches with their parents. Megan in particular. The thing about this episode of Supernanny is Megan is kind of iconic. Like, look at her. She's giving Brat summer.
Don't pinch her.
Going
Don't hit her.
Look at that top. Yes, Megan, you are a glam girl. Years later, in her 20s, Megan spoke about her experience of the show airing. I watched it on the TV in my bedroom, my mum and dad watched it downstairs, and my sisters were asleep. I remember crying when it finished, and my mum came upstairs and said she was sorry. She was crying, and I was crying. Megan also explained that sometime after filming, her father left the family and neither her or her sisters have spoken to him since. Megan explained that her behaviour naturally improved as she got older because of changes in the family. I've talked about before on my channel how self-esteem is a product of how you're treated. Although, yes, you can work on your self-esteem as an individual, it's not a thing that just develops inside of you independent of anyone else's input. Your self-esteem is a result of how people treat you, especially your family. If you're told you're naughty or difficult or dramatic or bad, that is absolutely going to influence your sense of self and self-image. As a child, you believe what you're told, even if it's about yourself. And having that happen on TV must only make it so much worse. So instead of being a child who is struggling in an unsupportive home environment, it's a child who inherently has poor character. And that poor character is coming through due to the parents not being hard enough on the child. The Supernanny franchise even had a magazine at one point where parents would send in photos of their children that they had put on the naughty step. And that, my friends, is a little something I like to call weird as fuck. Even if you argue a young child won't understand the impact of their photo being in a magazine, they still had the experience of their parent shoving a camera in their face after they'd been put on the naughty step, which probably feels quite humiliating. I think some adults think that children aren't capable of being embarrassed or humiliated, but obviously they are. Also, the children on these shows are being marketed as bad or difficult or out of control. This is often framed to be without any reason. Simply calling a kid badly behaved doesn't acknowledge the heart of the issue. In some cases, maybe a child has additional needs, or maybe the parents are just missing a few tools here and there, but sometimes it's because something is wrong. Something is happening in the family system that is leading the child to behave in a certain way. And I think ignoring that and just managing the child's behaviour with discipline is doing a complete disservice to that child. I think it decenters the root cause or parental involvement and scapegoats the child. If a parent is harming or neglecting a child in some way, it would make sense that a child might be kind of mad about that. Back when Supernanny was airing, an article from The Guardian says, in the moral universe of Supernanny, if children spit or fight or swear, it is basically because they can. The only difference between them and good children is that they have been allowed to get away with it. Frost's techniques certainly appear to work, but they also imply that what she calls unacceptable behaviour could never be a legitimate protest. She often describes raging children as having a laugh, but they seldom look very happy to me. Isn't she curious about the reasons why?
Smoking around asthmatic children is not good.
Dr. Emma in the house.
Adult supremacy. Yes, It's very woke, it's very TikTok, laugh it up. Egocentrism is an aspect of early childhood development where a young child can't really differentiate between themselves and their caregiver yet. So kind of ends up believing that everything is about them or because of them. So for example, a child might give their favourite cuddly toy to their parent if the parent's upset, because the child assumes that whatever comforts them will also comfort another person. So the idea of adult centricism kind of spawns out of that. These terms might be misconstrued by some adults, so let me clarify before any of you like leave a comment like, oh, so do you think a child should be prime minister? Do you think the critique of adult centricism isn't saying that a child's opinion on how to do open heart surgery should be genuinely considered by an adult doctor doing open heart surgery. Adult centricism was coined in social work and refers to how children are basically powerless, and as adults we tend to think we understand children because we've been children. So it might make us feel like we don't have to consider the thoughts and feelings and experiences of children as much because we've been children ourselves. We tend to think that age and experience equip us better to make decisions for young people, but the ideas around adult centricism make us stop and think, is that actually the case? Do I, an adult who does not have the experience of being a child in the 2020s, actually understand the perspective of children and young people today? As adults, we invalidate children's experiences in a way that we might not invalidate our own. When a child is being grumpy, it's not considered as valid as an adult emotion. The child is considered as being naughty or misbehaving, but adults are grumpy all the time. There are some very obvious violations of children's rights like child marriage and child soldiers, and you could argue that one of the reasons those things exist is because adults don't see children as fully fledged people with their own autonomy, and that notion, that belief, is very prevalent in our society, even if not as extreme. It's institutional even. We see it with the UK minimum wage, where a 16-year-old and a 25-year-old could be working in the same place, doing the exact same job, but the 16-year-old gets paid less just because they're 16. We see it in some US states where it's illegal, a status offence, for a minor to run away from home. In England, we currently have a legal loophole which allows parents to get away with smacking their children. More on this in just a second. We see it on a global scale with how adults are ruining the environment and leaving younger generations to deal with the aftermath. There have even been instances of adults' right to free speech and activism being prioritised over the rights of children, like the UK activist group that existed in the 70s and 80s called the Paedophile Information Exchange, who advocated for abolishing the age of consent completely. Although no laws were actually passed, that activism was allowed to continue for 10 years, and we definitely see adult supremacy in the schooling system. There's a style of parenting that we sometimes see in shows like Wife Swap and Supernanny called authoritarian parenting. I'm going to be coming back to this later, but we also see this very rigid authoritarian type of discipline and structure in the schooling system, with teachers requiring children to ask to take off their blazers, teachers saying no to children taking off their blazers, not allowing children to go to the toilet, and there's a school trust in my hometown that now requires kids to ask to go to the toilet during lunchtime, punishes late students by telling them to stand facing a wall, and has banned kids from going outside at lunch. Being imprisoned in a building for 6 hours is good for children's mental health, actually. In England, corporal punishment in schools was only made illegal in 1986, and in private schools in 1999, which means if you're around my age, a lot of our parents were at school when beatings, canings, and smacking were legal. My dad actually got caned by a teacher so severely that the cane broke in half, and it's interesting to see how society describes this. It's often justified as of its time and a cultural norm that has now shifted, which I suppose is true, but it's also physical abuse. A lot of our parents were victims of physical abuse as children. In 2005, England passed a law that said smacking your own child is illegal unless it amounts to reasonable punishment, which is assessed by the child's age and the force of the smack. A parent can't leave marks on a child, like bruises or scratches. Other than that, what's considered as reasonable is up for interpretation, I guess. To me, this is a flagrant and obvious indictment of what we might call adult supremacy, especially when you consider that for adults in England, we are legally protected against all types of physical harm. There's no law that says it's okay to smack an adult as long as you don't leave bruises or scratches. And if we'd consider that a human rights violation for us adults, why do we accept it for children? Some spaces on the internet have developed this culture of not wanting to comment or speculate on other people's lives, which does seem like reasonable backlash against the constant invasive monitoring of influencers and celebrities. However, I think as a society, we have to be able to look at something and call it abuse. We have to be able to look at something and call it a mental health issue. Without this, situations go unnoticed, unacknowledged. We misunderstand people. We fail people. I believe that there is nothing wrong with needing more information on something before reaching a conclusion, or maybe never reaching a solid conclusion at all. Maybe your opinion is more in the grey area. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do think we need to be able to see behaviour in media and in real life, and at the very least, flag it as something that looks like abuse. Epistemic injustice is when a person's voice is dismissed due to a bias that someone else has about them. Their capacity to know something or their ability to describe something is taken less seriously or disbelieved altogether. In the paper Seen But Not Heard, the researchers ask, are children readily believed or indeed heard compared to adults? Are adults biased in a way that makes children more vulnerable to epistemic injustice? Do adults believe that children cannot tell the difference between fact and fiction, or readily make things up? I think in particular kids struggle with hermeneutical injustice, which is to do with a gap in knowledge. So children might be trying to explain how they feel about something or describe something that's happened to them, but literally not have the words. And it's really important to label things as hermeneutical injustice, because if people don't have the knowledge to explain what they're experiencing, they live their life differently. They may think that what's happening to them is okay because they don't have the correct words. A great example of this is when the term sexual harassment was first coined in the 1970s. Before this, many women would have thought what was happening to them was normal or okay because there wasn't a term to indicate that it was wrong. A child could be acting out because they don't have the language to explain that something is wrong in their family unit. Adults can often dismiss children's behaviour as just being naughty or difficult rather than it being the symptom of a deeper issue. It might be assumed that the adult is in the right just because they're an adult. And even when a child can articulate something, the adult's word may be believed instead. Again, just because they're an adult.
Night night.
Go home.
She just told me to go home.
So, you might remember the Reimer family, who raised their children with leather paddles hanging on their bedroom doors that they used to hit them with, and were fixated on maintaining their daughter's purity.
Our instrument of discipline is the whacker. After they have been disciplined, they must ask for forgiveness.
You could say that these are examples of authoritarian parenting. Authoritarian parenting is strict and domineering. It's quite controlling of children and has a lot of high expectations and dishes out a lot of punishments. It's not really warm and it's not really responsive to children's feelings. But maybe you just think that sounds like good old-fashioned discipline. It is similar to old-fashioned or dated parenting that a lot of our grandparents or older generations would have experienced as children. But maybe that is why they're literally referred to as the silent generation, a generation of repression where people were raised in a way where emotions weren't tolerated. You sucked it up and got on with things. Sounds healthy. I was born in the wrong era. There are actually 4 main parenting styles that researchers found, and you can measure them on this grid. Authoritarian parenting is demanding and cold. Authoritative parenting is demanding but supportive. Permissive parenting is undemanding but supportive, and uninvolved parenting is neither. It's undemanding and unsupportive. The way a child is parented is obviously going to have an impact, and with the high level of discipline and control found in authoritarian parenting, research actually shows higher levels of aggression within those children, as well as a likelihood for them to rebel against their parents and to struggle with things like low self-esteem and have a difficulty socializing. This book called Trust Kids helped me a lot with this video. It's a collection of essays written by adults and children, and it includes the quote, "Yes, kids are not trusted, and then they grow up feeling like they have to treat their kids like that too. I have noticed in my wider community and online that there are many teens and young adults seeming to hold grudges against kids, and it really comes from that place of hurt, that place of feeling like they weren't trusted as kids and had hard childhoods. So now when their kids are being trusted and having a good time, they feel jealous and terrible about it. It's a terrible feedback loop where the parent is triggered and hurt and so replicates it. People often debate the differences in parents' behaviour within all of these parenting styles, but I think it's more interesting to look at the beliefs parents hold about children. Authoritarian parents often believe that a child's opinion holds no value, that children should be seen and not heard, and they should always automatically respect their elders. And these beliefs is what drives the actions of parents. The Stockdales were a strict conservative family on wife swap with homeschooled children who played in a successful family band. One of the kids, Jacob, went on to murder his mum and brother, then made an attempt on his own life. He spent 2 years in a mental health institution before being sentenced to 30 years in prison. And honestly, there's little information online about why exactly Jacob chose to do this. Laurie, the woman who swapped into his family during the TV show, believes he just snapped due to the really strict upbringing him and his siblings had. She tells a sad story from her time there about how when she loosened the family rules a little bit, Jacob erupted into tears, believing that he was going to go to hell for disobeying. Jacob Young was a boy on supernanny, and he grew up to be labelled a danger to women after stalking a drunk woman and raping her. He was sentenced to 10 years and an extended licence period of 5 years. Callum Steer was also a boy on supernanny who was sentenced to 8 years in prison for the unprovoked attempted murder of a 31-year-old man. And I want to be really clear, I'm not attributing all of the responsibility to the parents for the choices that these children grew up to make. We know that there are often a lot of contributing factors to crimes like these. It's likely never 100% the parents' fault. What we do know though is early childhood experiences and the way you are raised has a massive impact on your personality, your mental health, how you form your values and moral compass. And something I take a slight issue with in things like true crime documentaries, for example, is when people say things like, this serial killer, for example, had a completely normal childhood with no abuse involved. We can literally not know that. Even if the family of a person who commits a violent crime, even if they say there was no abuse, how would we know for definite? And it should be said, I'm not a parent. I don't know what it's like to have my own kids. In our society, it's often thought of as rude to criticise a parent's way of raising their child, especially if you don't have kids yourself. Just as I mentioned earlier about how it's important to label things as abuse or as a mental health issue, I think it's important for us to be able to collectively agree that certain ways of parenting are not okay. Surely that's how we progress as a society and in our treatment of children. There's always an element of different strokes for different folks. Every child is different. They may need to be parented slightly differently. But I do think we should normalise the wider discussion of parenting in our communities. We see all of these different parenting styles in supernanny and wife swap. We see permissive parenting where the parents are warm and friendly but very lenient with very few demands and avoiding confrontation. We see uninvolved parenting where there's just kind of an absence. There's little support or guidance provided for anything. A lot of people tend to criticise these sort of parents for being just simply bad parents, and I think there's definitely a valid element of criticising these parents, but I don't think that always really helps the problem. For Kelly, for example, a mum from wife swap who describes herself as lazy. She's apathetic and tired all the time and leaves pretty much everything up to her husband. Yes, we can criticise her for bad parenting and we can wish for better for her child, but could there be a mental health issue going on here? Is it fair or accurate to chalk everything up to this mother's personal failure of being a mother? There's a major flaw I see with these TV shows, and that is they don't ever look at the root cause of things. I suppose, how could they? They're less than an hour-long episodes filmed without any mental health professionals that I'm aware of anyway. Searching for the root cause isn't really embedded into the show's structure. Anytime we see a parent falling short, it's framed automatically as a personal failure or a character flaw on their part, whereas the reality for a lot of these people is that their issues may run a lot deeper. These shows are like putting a plaster or a band-aid for my American viewers over a gaping wound.
comes right up to me and looking into my eye and saying, I hate you.
The way we typically think about trauma and biology isn't quite right. When I first started hearing the term generational trauma or intergenerational trauma, I heard it in a much more like spiritual context. It did give me the impression there wasn't much scientific basis for it, but that's not exactly true. The field of epigenetics helps us understand how traumatic experiences can affect our biology and can be passed down through generations literally in our bodies. We know that we inherit our genetics from our parents, and we can think of genes like sheet music. Those are our body's instructions, but we need someone to actually read the sheet music, to read the instructions, and that is something called epigenetics. So our genes are the sheet music and our epigenetics are the way the sheet music is read. This means that when we inherit certain genetics from our parents, they're actually not set in stone because it depends on how they are read. Something might happen in your environment that makes your epigenetics read a certain note on the sheet music over and over again, which effectively is turning on a gene. This is what people mean when they say that trauma affects us on a physiological level. And this helps us to describe intergenerational trauma. If something happens in your environment that turns on or turns off a gene, you will be passing on new genetic functioning to your child. This is why we see, for example, children of Holocaust survivors experiencing symptoms of PTSD, even though they were never in the Holocaust themselves. It's not your fault if something happened in your environment that changed your genetic functioning. These changes in functioning is just the way the human body reacts to trauma. It's not a case of blaming a parent for their genetic functioning. It's a case of parents and future parents becoming aware of their own trauma and how they can manage it so that it affects their children as little as possible. So, as you may have realised by now, this video talking about wife swap and super nanny has kind of been an in to talking about how I believe our society's attitude towards children needs to continue evolving, how children deserve more respect, how we must have higher standards for ourselves as adults and continue working to break cycles for future generations. And I believe that we all have the responsibility to become a trusted adult, regardless of if we're parents or not. If you made it this far, thank you for watching this video. It's been a beast to film. If you are in a position where you're able to become a channel member, I would love to welcome you into the bug colony. I have a video out right now for my channel members about my 2024 and why I haven't uploaded a YouTube video in ages and like what's been going on and my future plans for this channel. My Instagram, Substack and TikTok are all linked in the description down below, and I will see you in my next video. Goodbye. The general safety aspect of putting your show on a kid. What the heck is that? And towns that they were living in. Don't listen. Is this a true crime channel?